Well, happy Sabbath everyone here, and to those also who are connected into us today on Zoom. It's good to be up here with you all again. I've got a little bit of a raspy voice, so just bear with me today. And welcome back now to the Biography channel and to part 2 of Lessons from Abraham. Now, when I was up here last, we saw how God called Abraham out from his country in Mesopotamia to the land of Canaan, which would later become the land of Israel, the new name for his grandson Jacob. Now, we also saw how God chose Abraham and promised to develop his descendants into a group of influential nations chosen for the purpose of teaching and being an example of his way of life to the rest of the world. Now, God had promised Abraham a son through whom God would develop a great nation, though he hadn't been specific about stating it would come from Sarah's body. Now, we saw how Sarah, who was in her 70s at the time in Genesis 15, was barren, and she took matters into her own hand regarding God's promise of a son and convinced Abraham to have a child through her handmaid Hagar. Now, legally, in the customs of the day, the child would be Sarah's, even though Hagar was the surrogate mother. Now, soon after, Abraham has a son through Hagar, and they call his name Ishmael. Now, when Abraham is 99 years old, the Lord visibly appears to him again. Now, this is the second time that Genesis says that he appeared to Abraham. He then further expanded on the promises he's making with Abraham. Now, God then makes it clear that it is Sarah who will give birth to the son that he has promised them, and that she would become a mother of nations. Now, God changes the name of both Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah to emphasize the promise that he has made to them. Now, God changes Abram's name to Abraham and Sarai's name to Sarah. Now, Abraham means exalted father or father of height, which might imply that he was quite tall. And Abraham means father of nations. Now, Sarai means princess, while Sarah means queen. Now, in ancient blood covenants, there was often as part of that covenant, an exchange of names that took place. Now, this is likely to be the origin of a wife taking on the name of her husband. Now, after God had made a covenant with Abraham, Abram and Sarai both received the H from Yahweh, and the God became known as the God of Abraham. Now, Abraham falls on his face before God and laughs as he thinks to himself, "Shall Sarah have a child at 90 years old?" He then tries to convince God to work the promises through Ishmael, who he's very fond of and is his only son at this point. Now, God tells him no, Sarah will bear a child and he will establish the birthright covenant through him. Now, having noticed Abraham's reaction of laughter, God has a thought in response to that. He tells Abraham, "I want you to name him Isaac," which is a name that means laughter. Now, in Genesis 21:12, it says that his descendants shall be named after Isaac. And one fulfillment of this is the descendants of Abraham's grandson, Joseph, who became known as the Saxons, or who the British people and many of us Australians are descended from. Now, the name Saxons means sons of Isaac, but translated more fully, the name Saxon actually means sons of laughter, which I think is a very appropriate name, as I believe that us Australians and English make the best comedians. Now, before Abraham and Sarah, who was beyond childbearing age, had a child together, God gave Abraham a new name that meant a father of a multitude of nations. Now, this illustrates a point that is found over in Romans 4, verse 17, where it says that God will call those which don't exist as though they already do. Now, in Romans 4:21, it points out that after Abraham's initial reaction, that he was fully, not partially convinced that God would perform what he promised to do, which would require something supernatural for Sarah to bear a child. Now, back a few verses in Romans 4 verse 13, Paul adds a detail that is not seen in the book of Genesis, where we see an expansion of the promise to Abraham's seed, not just from the land of Canaan, but a promise to be an heir and inherit the whole world. Now, there would be a physical seed who would inherit the land of Canaan and the birthright lands around the world, which the English-speaking nations came to colonise and possess. But there would also be a spiritual seed of Abraham who would inherit the whole world. Now, Paul speaks of Christians being the spiritual descendants of Abraham in Galatians 3 verse 29. Now, Albert Barnes, in his commentary on Romans 4:13, writes the following. When the apostle calls him the heir of the world, he sums up in this comprehensive expression all the promises made to Abraham, intimating that his spiritual descendants, that is, those who possess his faith, shall yet be so numerous to possess all lands. End of quote. Now, while there is no promise of Abraham's descendants inheriting the whole world in Genesis, we do see the idea of his spiritual descendants inheriting the world in other places in the Old Testament. Now, one place is where David says in Psalm 37 that the meek shall inherit the earth, which Jesus, of course, quoted in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, David also has a vision of the saints inheriting the kingdom of God and ruling the earth with Jesus Christ over in Daniel 7. Now, the site of Mamre is a site just a little bit north of Hebron where Abraham dwelt. Now, the site here is believed to be Mamre is today called Ramat el Khalil. Now, Ramat or Ramoth in the Hebrew means heights, and Al Khalil means friend of God. Now, this location here has a large enclosure that's around it that was built by King Herod the Great, which was built over an earlier enclosure thought to be dated possibly to the time of David. Now, in the centre of the site are the remains of an altar. Now, according to Genesis 13:18, Abraham built an altar here at Mamre. Now, there's also a spring within the enclosure that's seen at the back of the photo on the top right. Now, near a spring is probably a good place where trees would grow, such as the oaks described to have been there at Mamre. Now, it was here, near the oak trees of Mamre, that the Lord appears to Abraham for at least the third time. Now, this time he reconfirms his promise that he would have a son, and it was here that the Lord and Abraham discussed the fate of Sodom, which the Lord intended to destroy. Now, God appears to Abraham again at Mamre near Hebron with two other men, who are the angels who later go down to retrieve Lot from Sodom. Now, Abraham quickly prepares a meal for them. Now, he prepares some venison meat along with some dairy products, both milk and butter, and they eat what has been set before him. Now, if you go to Israel today, they have this very strange interpretation of the statute of not boiling a kid in its mother's milk, where they will not mix dairy products and meat together in the same meal. Now, some restaurants over there are actually duplex in nature, where you eat dairy in one and then go next door to eat meat. Now, if you go to Israel today, don't ever ask for some meat on your pizza, which I did not just once, but twice to my chagrin. Now, this example here of Abraham eating butter, milk and venison together shows that Jewish interpretation of that statute is actually quite incorrect. Now, when Sarah, like Abraham, laughs at the news that she would bear a son at her age, she is asked a very good question that we should think about whenever we doubt over God's promises. Is there anything that is too hard for the Lord? Now, Abraham knows that Lot and his family are living in Sodom, and he knows that the Lord has come to destroy it. Now, it's interesting that the Lord says that I will go down now and see whether what they have done according to the cry that has come out to me. Now, we might think of God as having this bank of TV screens up in heaven where he sees everything. Now, while he could know everything that way, if he chose to, we find that the angels report to him and he decides to personally investigate himself. Now, hoping to save Lot and any of his household beyond his immediate family, remember Lot's herdsman from chapter 13, Abraham humbly pleads with God to spare Sodom if there are 50 righteous amongst the wicked. Now, Abraham is quite bold about saying, would you also destroy the righteous with the wicked? Now, suppose that there were 50 righteous within the city, would you also destroy the place and not spare it for the 50 righteous that were in it? Far be it from you to do such a thing as this, to slay the righteous with the wicked. Now, the Lord graciously agrees not to destroy the city if there are 50 righteous people in it. Now, not knowing whether it is enough to spare Lot's household, Abraham continues to negotiate with God a number of times, bringing the number all the way down to 10. Now, it's almost like an auction. I hear 50, how about 40? Do I hear 30, 20, 10? Sold. Now, Abraham probably feels he's done enough now to spare the city and Lot's family, but it turns out there's not even 10 righteous in the city. Now, despite there not being 10 righteous, God has already decided to spare Lot's family, which he's assigned to the 2 angels to take care of. Now, the boldness in which Abraham interceded for the lives of the people of Sodom should be reflected in our own prayer life with God. Now, we know we sin quite regularly, but as long as we are striving to go in the right direction, we should trust in the gracious, kind and merciful character of God whenever we intercede for others and for our own pressing needs. Now, in Hebrews 4:16, Paul tells us to come boldly to the throne of grace that we may obtain mercy and find grace in time of need. Now, this brings us to the 4th lesson that we can learn from the life of Abraham. Be bold in your prayer life with God, trusting that he will be merciful and gracious in the way that he responds. Now, the 2 angels go to Sodom and Lot takes them into his house. Now, a whole group of men, both young and old, surround Lot's house and demand Lot to turn over the strangers so they can basically gang rape them. Now, in Genesis 15:16, God said that he would not dispossess the land and give it to Abraham's descendants until the 4th generation, as the sins of the Amorites were not yet full. Now, with Sodom and Gomorrah, though, he makes an exception because the level of their sin was full, as demonstrated by their example of homosexual lust that was shown here. Now, I don't know if you remember, but I remember seeing a 10-part drama series called The Bible, which was on the History Channel, which has some terribly woke interpretations of Scripture. Now, they avoided this homosexual scene altogether, and then they had 2 angels, one looking like a black guy and the other looking like an Asian guy, then kill more people with their swords than the true means of death by fire and brimstone. Now, we see in this story that Lot is not unaffected by the moral corruption surrounding him, though it did grieve him. I mean, tragically, he offers his daughters if they would leave his guests alone. And then the angels then blind the crowd of sodomites so they would part. Now, the angels tell Lot and his family to flee to the mountains as the city is about to be destroyed and to not look back. Now, Lot's sons-in-law ridicule the message and they stay put. Now, Lot had 2 daughters who had not known a man and were unmarried, but he also had at least 2 other married daughters as well who lived close by in the city with their Lot's sons-in-law. Now, the angels, after Lot's family linger, grab a hold of Lot, his wife and his 2 unmarried daughters, and take them out of the city. Now, early in the morning, after they walked several hours and made it to Zoar, God then rained fire and brimstone and destroyed the cities of the plain. Now, despite the moral corruption, there appears to have been a high degree of physical affluence there, and Lot's wife doesn't want to say goodbye to Sodom, and as she turns back, she is turned into a pillar of salt. Now, when Jesus compared the events of the Great Tribulation ahead of us to the time of Sodom's destruction, he warned us not to be like Lot's wife in Luke 17:32, wanting more of what this immoral world offers than obeying God and fleeing when necessary. Now, in previous messages, I've shown evidence that points to the Exodus occurring at the end of Egypt's Middle Kingdom in the Middle Bronze Age, rather than the generally accepted Late Bronze Age, where there is no evidence for the Exodus. Now, the end of the Middle Kingdom is dated about 315 years earlier than the Exodus. Now, if the Exodus was at the end of the Middle Kingdom, then the standard dates for both the Old and Middle Kingdom of Egypt would have to move at least 300 years forward in time. Now, the standard chronology places the end of the early Bronze Age and Egypt's Old Kingdom about 2150 BC. So, if we move this date 300 years forward, we come up with a new date of about 1850 for the end of the early Bronze Age. Now, what's interesting is that this date just happens to coincide with the biblical catastrophe that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah in the time of Abraham. Now, commenting on the magnitude of events which brought an end to the early Bronze Age, Kathleen Kenyon, who excavated Jericho, writes the following: "The final end of the early Bronze civilization came with catastrophic completeness. Jericho was probably completely destroyed. Every town in Palestine that has been so far investigated shows the same break. All traces of the early Bronze Age civilization disappeared." End of quote. Ernest Wright also wrote, "One of the most striking facts about the early Bronze civilization is its destruction, one so violent that scarcely a vestige of it survived. We do not know when the event took place. We only know that there is not an early Bronze Age city excavated or explored in all Palestine which does not have a gap in its occupation between the early Bronze Age 3 and the Middle Bronze Age." End of quote. Now, various locations have been put forth for the location of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, one of those theories that was popularised in the 1980s and 90s was one put forth by Ron Wyatt. Now, along the southwest side of the Dead Sea, he noticed some canyon-like formations in what he thought were great layers of ash. Now, scattered throughout these layers were white sulphur balls. Now, one of these sites is at the base of the famous site of Masada, which he claimed was the site of Gomorrah. Now, it's shown in the top right photo that I took here of on the cable car going up to the top of Masada. Now, further south, in front of a mountain which has been dubbed Mount Sodom, was the site that he claims was Sodom. And just south of it is a natural rock outcrop which has been dubbed Lot's wife. Now, going further south was another canyon like the site that he claims is Zoar, where Lot originally fled to. Now, Zoar has these same layers that he notes as at these other two sites that Ron Wyatt claims is ash. However, if we note in Genesis 19:21, it says that Zoar was actually spared, not destroyed with the rest of the cities. Now, there are no archaeological ruins or artefacts at any of these sites. Now, what he claims is ash is actually a rock called marlstone. Now, marl or marlstone is a carbonate-rich mud or mudstone which contains variable amounts of clay and silt that's found all over the Jordan River Valley. It's a sedimentary rock laid down in layers like in the photo here on the left. Now, I had a good long look at the supposed ruins of Gomorrah when I was up there at Masada. I really couldn't see anything that looked anything other than natural geological formation. Now, while I think there is little support for his proposed location, I do believe that Ron Wyatt correctly identified the agents of destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, with these flammable white sulphur balls found in great numbers all around the southern shores of the Dead Sea. Now Genesis 19:24 says that God rained down fire and brimstone on Sodom and Gomorrah. Now the word brimstone is an old English word for sulphur, and it's easy to imagine God raining down these sulphur balls. Now in recent years there has been a surprising new candidate promoted as Sodom by archaeologist Stephen Collins, who's been excavating a site on the opposite side of the Jordan River to Jericho. Now he has proposed this site as Sodom because of a couple of reasons. Now one is evidence that supports a Middle Bronze Age destruction by the intense heat and fire of exploding large meteorite. Now the second is because the Hebrew word translated plain, when Genesis speaks of the cities of the plain, is Karkar, which possibly means circle. And the plains of Moab, just north of the Dead Sea, is roughly circular. Now circle is one of a couple of possible translations here that fits. Now as to that cosmic fireball that Collins has uncovered evidence for, this would explain the fire but not necessarily the brimstone. Now I'm not aware of any of these sulphur balls being found along the northern shores of the Dead Sea. Now there's also a couple of major problems with his theory that was explored in one of the Beyond Today articles. Now Ezekiel 16:46 tells us that Sodom was in the opposite direction from Jerusalem as Samaria. Now Sodom was in the opposite direction from Samaria as you're facing east, which would also be to the south, not east. Now Tel Ammam is actually a few degrees north of east from Jerusalem. Now the other major problem with his theory is that Tel Ammam has had many layers of occupation after its Middle Bronze Age destruction. Now following a long break after that destruction, it was occupied again during the Iron Age when Israel's prophets spoke to the nation. Now Genesis 49:8 and 50:40 both say, as in the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah and their neighbours, says the Lord, no one shall remain there, nor shall a man dwell in it. Now Zephaniah 2:9, quoted here, also says, Moab shall be like Sodom, and the people of Ammon like Gomorrah, overrun with weeds and salt pits, and a perpetual desolation. Now it would be very strange to make such prophecies if the site of Solomon was occupied when these prophecies were actually given. And the verse in Zephaniah implies Sodom was a perpetual ruin and never rebuilt. Now the earliest historical traditions place the cities of the plain near the southeast end of the Dead Sea. Now the famous Medeba map mosaic from the Byzantine period shows Zoar and Lot's Cave near the southeast corner of the Dead Sea. Now this is where the famous archaeologist William Albright went looking for them in the 1920s. Now Baba Drah was the first early Bronze Age site found along the southeast side of the Dead Sea by Albright in 1924. Now Baba Drah was a walled city along Wadi Kerak that was 4 acres in size. Now its population is estimated to have been around 1,000, yet around the city were about 20,000 tombs which were documented. Now Baba Drah was burned by fire at the end of the early Bronze Age, and it was never re-inhabited. Now in the 1970s, 4 additional sites were discovered south of Baba Drah. Now subsequent excavations at Numeira, 13 kilometres south of Baba Drah, have verified its close affinity with Baba Drah, suggesting that it may have been Gomorrah. Now like Baba Drah, 3 of the 4 sites shown here were destroyed by fire at the end of the early Bronze Age. Now one of them though continued on well beyond the early Bronze Age, and that was Safi. Now Safi is where the Medeba map shown before places Zoar. Now archaeologist Joel Kramer on his Expedition Bible YouTube channel has a wonderful video about these sites that goes much deeper into the evidence for these sites. Now Genesis 19:21 says that Zoar was spared and not destroyed so Lot could escape there. Now, what is very interesting about the location of Saphi, the proposed site of Zoar, in relation to the other four sites, is that it is actually in the middle of those four sites, not at the end of them. Now, this implies that something miraculous occurred for it to be spared from the destruction of the other cities. Now, one can imagine Lot sitting at one of the gates of Sodom and the debauchery at the Sodom disco where they would boogie like there's no Gomorrah, as shown on the cartoon on the right. Jeff Robinson, who was in the top photo here that I took at Babadra, said that at the Lot Hotel on the other side of the Dead Sea, they actually had a disco there called the Sodom Disco when he was in Israel back in the 1980s. Now, was the cosmic destruction event that destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah just a local event, or was it perhaps much greater as hinted in the archaeology of the early Bronze Age? Now, in the London Sunday Times article, Rajiv Sayal wrote the following: "A cataclysmic shower of giant meteors destroyed the great Bronze Age civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia and Greece by provoking a series of natural disasters. New archaeological and astronomical evidence indicates that a huge number of extraterrestrial bodies caused famine, flooding and bushfires thousands of miles wide that led to the collapse of the world's first sophisticated civilizations," end of quote. Now, just east of Saphi in the nearby mountains overlooking the south end of the Dead Sea is what is claimed to be Lot's wife, where a Byzantine church is that matches what is on the Medieval map. Now, the sheer violence of the Sodom and Gomorrah catastrophe by fire and brimstone that sank the Jordan River Valley explains the unusual reaction of Lot's daughters. Now, in Genesis 19:31-32 we read, "And the firstborn said to the younger, 'Our father is old, and there is no man in the earth to come into us in all the way of the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, so that we may preserve seed of our father.'" Now, they actually had the thought that there were no other living survivors on the face of the earth, and they went to this drastic step of getting their father drunk to have sex with him in order to perpetuate the human race. Now, sandwiched in between the destruction of Sodom in Genesis 19 and the birth of Isaac in Genesis 21 is the story of Abraham dwelling at Gerar, and for the second time passing off his wife as his sister to the Philistine king Abimelech. Now, Gerar was situated between Gaza and Beersheba. Now, Abraham and later Isaac both stayed here at Gerar at different times to feed their flocks from the better pasture that was there compared to Hebron and Beersheba. Now, most scholars today identify Gerar with Tel Horor, which is about halfway between Gaza and Beersheba on the banks of the Nahal Gerar. Now, Gerar is the first Philistine city mentioned in the Bible. Now, both Abraham and later Isaac passed off their wife as their sister, leading to complications with two of Gerar's Philistine kings, both of whom were named Abimelech, which was more of a title, like the Pharaoh. Now, what is the most astonishing part of the story with Abraham here at Gerar is just how old Sarah was. Now, Sarah was 90 years old at this time. Now, Abimelech was still taken enough with Sarah's beauty to take her into his harem at her age, just as Pharaoh did 25 years earlier. Now, she must have been quite a stunning woman to have that sort of effect on these men. Now, in Genesis 21, God follows through on his promise to give Abraham a son through Sarah, and Isaac is born when Abraham is about 100 years old. Now, Sarah is 90 years old and loves the name Isaac that God has chosen, for which she says, "God has made me laugh, and all who hear will laugh with me." Now, Beersheba was at the southern end of the Way of the Patriarchs, or the bridge route, after the descent from Hebron before it became the way to Shur and continued on to Egypt. Now, Abimelech's men had taken the well from Abraham after he had previously dug it. Now, Abraham set aside 7 lambs to swear that he had dug the well. Now, Abimelech then considered that it belonged to Abraham, and the two of them make a covenant. Now, the word Sheba can mean both oath and 7. So the name Beersheba means both well of 7 and also well of the oath. Now, both Abraham and later his son Isaac dig wells here at Beersheba. Now, there happens to actually be 2 wells at the Abraham's Well International Visitor Centre in the old city part of modern Beersheba today. Now, these wells are 2 of the best candidates for being the wells of Abraham and Isaac. Now, it is here at Beersheba that God asked Abraham to go to the land of Moriah to offer Isaac, and later where Jacob tricks Isaac to give him the blessing. Now, in Genesis 22, God decides to test Abraham. Now, before this, we know that he visibly appeared to him at least 3 times before, plus another time in vision in Genesis 15, as well as possibly other appearances like when he spoke to him in Genesis 13. Now, God talks to Abraham here, and possibly may have appeared to him as well, and he tells him to take his only son. Remember that Ishmael and Hagar at this time have been sent away previously. And he asks Abraham to offer Isaac as a burnt sacrifice. Now, notice here in this verse that it says it is to happen on one of the mountains in the land of Moriah, as opposed to Mount Moriah, where most people assume that it happened. Now, imagine your reaction if God asked you to do such a thing today. Now, shock and disbelief would no doubt have been his first reaction. Now, in verse 3, it then simply says that he got ready and did what God had told him to do. Now, was it as simple and matter of fact as this concise account might lead us to believe? Now, was there any reaction of hurt and anger before he forced himself to do as God commanded him, as shown in the famous 1960s Bible movie In the Beginning? Now, I remember a minister in another church totally ruling out such a possible reaction. Now, no doubt, Abraham would have initially thought that it was inconsistent with God's loving character to ask him to sacrifice his son, like we see happen with other pagan gods. Now, being human like the rest of us, it is not out of the question Abraham may have had some initial hurt and anger towards God as he wrestled with this command to give up his long-awaited promised son. Now, we don't know how he emotionally reacted, but we do know how he logically processed this request that initially would have made no sense at all. Now, Abraham had to be sure that God and not some other spirit being from the dark side was requesting this from him. But once sure on that point, Abraham knew that God had promised nations would come specifically through Isaac, not some other later replacement son. Now, as the wheels turned in his head, he concluded that the only way that God could possibly fulfill that promise, if he slew Isaac as a burnt sacrifice, would be if God were to resurrect Isaac. Now, what you have to realise about how brave a decision this was to obey God was that there was absolutely no precedent. At this point in man's history, no one has ever been resurrected physically back to life. Now, the very first example of this in the Bible we read about is Elijah raising up a widow's son. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us how old Isaac was at this time. Now, he is referred to as a lad in most translations, but this word can also mean a young man. Now, did Abraham eventually tell Isaac what he was commanded to by God? And did Isaac willingly submit to this? Now, the chances are pretty high that both of those things happened, even though the scripture is silent about it. Now, Abraham offering up Isaac was a type of God the Father offering up his only son. Now, we know that Jesus willingly submitted to what the Father had decreed should happen to pay for our sins. Now, Isaac was a type of Jesus giving his life for us, so he probably did submit willingly, given that he would have been probably old enough to overpower his elderly father if he indeed resisted. Now, it is assumed that this mountain in the land of Moriah was where the Temple Mount is today, but since it was a type of God offering up his son, it may have happened where Jesus himself was killed. Now, there is good symbolic evidence pointing to the Mount of Olives as being the place where the crucifixion took place. And this was where the sin offerings and the red heifer were killed to the east of the temple. Now, Abraham would have gone through with slaying his son were it not for the intervention of an angel telling him to stop, and God then provides a ram to sacrifice instead that is caught in a thicket. Now, back in the 1930s, Leonard Woolley at the more famous found a beautiful gold-plated sculpture which is in the British Museum today. Now, back in the 1930s, when interest and respect for the Bible was much higher, it was labelled as the ram in the thicket. Now, the horns on the sculpture, however, are the straight horns of a goat rather than the curved horns of a ram. Now, Abraham's willingness to give up his only son Isaac brings us to the fifth lesson that we can learn from Abraham's life. True living faith or trust in God is demonstrated and proven by fully obedient actions. Now, in James 2, verses 20 to 22, James wrote, "Faith without works is dead. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered Isaac his son on the altar? Do you see that faith was working together with his works, and by works faith was made perfect?" Now, if you believe God, you'll prove it by doing your best to obey his laws with the help and power of God. What you do proves how much you believe God's laws are best deep down in your heart. Now, there are three places in the Bible where Abraham is referred to as the friend of God. The first place is 2 Chronicles 20 verse 7. The second place is Isaiah 41 verse 8. And the last place is James 2 verse 23. Now, in that last place, it is in the context of his faith and obedience and being willing to offer his son Isaac. Now, we've seen that there have been a few occasions where God appeared to Abraham, like when he first told Abraham that he would inherit the land, and also where he appeared to him at Mamre and they discussed the fate of Sodom. In Exodus 33:11, it says that the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend. Now, this honourable description of being the friend of God was probably applied to Abraham, not just because of his faith and obedience, but also because of the face-to-face conversations that the two had at times. Now, in Genesis 23, his beloved wife Sarah dies, and he arranges to buy a field with a cave in Hebron to bury her. In Genesis 24, Abraham wants to find a wife for his son Isaac. Now, he is very insistent that he does not marry a Canaanite woman, showing a very strong preference for him to marry a woman of his own people. So he commissions his older servants to go back and find a wife for Isaac. Now, the servant asks God for a sign that shows the woman has a caring and service-orientated attitude, but not just offering him, but also his animals water as well from a local well. Now, the woman God selects for Isaac is Rebekah, the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor, and she agrees to the match, returning with Abraham's servant to the land of Canaan. Now, Sarah was 127 when she died. Now, Abraham then lived on another 38 years after her death. And Abraham took on another wife by the name of Keturah, and despite Abraham's old age, he has an amazing 6 more sons through Keturah. Now, the best known of these sons was Midian. Now, if we remember when Moses fled to the land of Midian in northwest Saudi Arabia, he married the daughter of Jethro, who was also the priest of Midian. Now, in Genesis 23:19, we read that Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of the field of Machpelah. Now, the Hebrew word Machpelah means double or twofold, implying a double cave. Now, it became the tomb for 3 patriarchal couples: Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah. Now, Jacob's favourite wife, Rachel, who was buried in a tomb closer to Bethlehem, further up the road. Now, remember, Leah, who was buried here with Jacob, was the mother of Judah. So these 3 patriarchal couples were the first 3 couples in the land of Israel for King David. Now, this site has become an important holy site for the Jews. King Herod, an Edomite who was raised in the Jewish religion, built this structure above the caves. Now, its stones are very similar to the stones of the temple in Jerusalem, yet it wasn't destroyed by the Romans, and it has actually survived intact to this day. Now, it's in the West Bank territory, and it's part mosque. It's open to tourists. Now, the excavations at nearby Tel Hebron have uncovered city walls dating to both the early and middle Bronze Age period, and there's some steps leading up to the city gate. Now, Abraham lived in the transition period between the early and middle Bronze Age periods, and it would have been at that city gate where he negotiated the purchase of the cave of the field of Machpelah. Now, we read in Genesis 25 that Abraham died at the ripe old age of 175 and was buried in the same tomb that he purchased for his wife Sarah. Now, one thing that is quite touching in the story of his funeral is that Ishmael was able to come back and join Isaac to bury their father. Now, pictured here, Nahum Arnon, a member of the Jewish community of Hebron, tells a story on a YouTube video that he was part of a group back in the 1980s that in the middle of the night broke through the floor stones and found a passageway down to the double cave where they found human bones and pottery and artefacts of Middle Bronze and First Temple periods. Now, before we conclude, I'm going to play an extract from that video plus another extract from another video about Hebron by Joel Kramer.
Actually, the cave is located right beneath this memorial, and we have here 3 couples: Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah.
So the actual bones are down underneath here?
Yes, underneath.
How did you discover it?
Well, it was in the middle of the night, one of the last nights of the Jewish calendar, and there are special prayers, and people come here and blow the shofar and sing many songs. So there was a lot of noise, and we, covered by that noise, we got the tools to open the gates of heaven, like hammers, like chisels.
That was decades ago, and no one is allowed in the cave anymore.
There were some stairs leading to a dark and long tunnel. We have crawled through this tunnel. We took some stones from the floor, and then we discovered the cave. Actually, it's 2 caves. I found myself crawling amongst human bones. So it's really to touch the history, to touch the Bible.
So this is Hebron. So that's the Acropolis of the hill. That hasn't been excavated because it's a vulnerable place to do excavations in the past because of the tension. But that's certainly where, most likely where David's palace is located. So I want you to put David's palace up there and put King David up there for 7.5 years, ruling as the king of Judah, looking down on the ancestral tomb of his forefathers and mothers, where we just were. Now again, buried in that tomb is the specific lineage of Judah. His mother was Leah and Jacob, and you are standing in the heart of the territory of Judah. Mamre is on the road that connects Jerusalem to Hebron. On the road from Jerusalem to Hebron, Mamre is right off of that road. The opening line of the New Testament says, Matthew 1:1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham.
So Abraham was the great patriarch. His family God used to begin the work of developing his own nation, to model his way of life to the rest of the world as part of his great plan to reconcile all mankind to himself. Now, Matthew 8 verse 11, Jesus said that many will sit down with Abraham and the patriarchs in the kingdom of heaven. Now, Abraham indeed was the father of the faithful, and today we've looked, and in the previous message, we've looked at 5 key lessons that we can learn from his life, which I'll summarise now. 1, have the courage to leave what is comfortable and follow God even when you're not sure where doing it God's way will take you. 2, humility and deference to the needs of others is vital to live at peace with others. 3, compromises lead to inferior results and should be avoided. 4, be bold in your prayer life with God, trusting that he will be merciful and gracious in the way that he responds. And 5, true living faith or trust in God is demonstrated and proven by fully obedient actions. So let's all learn from the lessons of his life and be one of his true, faithful spiritual descendants. Thank you.